Welcome, everyone. I would like to welcome Steve Killelea, global philanthropist, founder, and executive chairman of international think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace. The Institute for Economics and Peace, or IEP, aims to create a paradigm shift in the way the world thinks about peace, using data-driven research to show that peace is a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and development. Under Mr. Killelea's direction, the IEP has released several influential reports, research, and indices that analyze the economic cost of violence and the levels of risk and fragility that affect different countries. It is perhaps best known for its Global Peace Index, a highly influential study that measures relative peace across nations and regions, and whose data and policy recommendations have been used by the World Bank and the UN. In 2020, the IEP released the inaugural edition of the Ecological Threat Register, or the ETR, which analyzed 157 states and territories by the ecological threats these countries face, their resilience, and how likely each nation is to cope with ecological shocks now or in the future. On October 7th, 2021, the second edition of the ETR was launched, incorporating a more holistic approach and covering a higher number of states and territories. So thank you, Steve, for taking the time to speak with us about the ETR.
Look, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the interview.
Great. So just to start, could you explain briefly kind of what the ETR hopes to achieve and why this is so important?
Well, I think what we're focusing on is the ecological shocks and ecological degradation, which is happening today. And what we do is we look at the relationship between that and conflict, and it's really is quite profound, that interconnection. It's very, very intimate. And then we also look at the countries which have got the least resilience to be able to cope with the shocks which they've got today and also the shocks which will happen in the future. And so the idea is to sort of get better focus on ecological degradation and conflict, and particularly in the lead up to COP. Now, obviously COP's just passed, but the lead up to COP, we wanted to get a better focus on that. Climate change is a massively important issue, but it'll only act as an amplifier on a lot of the existing issues that are there today. And those issues which exist today need attention today, because as they get further out of hand, it's just going to increase the levels of conflict globally. And the detail I'll come to in a little while.
Of course. So you were talking about these other risks that aren't necessarily climate change, but are amplified by climate change. What are these ecological threats that the report kind of delves into and explores?
Sure. So we look at it in two domains. So the first domain we see is the natural resources, and the other, as we see, is the sort of natural disasters. So sort of on the first domain, we look at sort of the availability of water, the agriculture, and the availability of food, and then changes in the population, because they all come together. So in the second domain, when we look at natural disasters, we're looking at things there like tsunamis, we're looking at cyclones, looking at floods, looking at droughts, and then temperature increases as well. And that gives us the ability then to be able to look at that. Now, what we do is there's about 7 different measures, and some of them have got sub-measures in them which we bring together. Then we extrapolate out to 2050 to get a better idea of exactly where the biggest risks are. And so when we look at that, what we find, and this is stunning, absolutely stunning. Like what we find is if you look at the 15 countries with the worst ecological degradation, or in the way we put it, the most ecological threats, 11 of those 15 are currently in conflict, and the other 4 are on watch list for substantial drops in peace. In fact, if we look at the country with the worst score, it's actually Afghanistan. And so what we can see when we look at it is a whole range of things which come together to cause these issues. So what happens is if you like, you've got this vicious cycle going on. You get the ecology gets damaged, less resources. So when you've got less resources, you're now likely to lead to conflict. That can degrade the resources even further. And so what'll happen then, sometimes you might have a peace deal done for a while, or the rains might return and the agriculture bounce on. But eventually, because of degradation in the environments and increase in populations, these conflicts come back. And then you've already got existing fault lines along which you've already had conflict, and it falls back along that. But it runs much deeper than this, because what we find is these countries that also have very, very low levels of resilience. So within the Institute for Economics and Peace, we've got these different ways of being able to measure resilience. And we measure it through a concept called positive peace, which I'm sure we'll come back to. And so what we do then is we look at the countries which have got the most number of ecological threats, and then look at the countries then also and their levels of resilience, which is their ability to be able to cope with it. Then that gives us a pretty clear idea of where the biggest risks are. So when we do that, it comes down into 30 what we call hotspot countries. Now, if we look at those countries, what we find is that 28 of those 30 countries are actually in the bottom half of the Global Peace Index. So 28 of the 30 are in the least peaceful half of the world. And so again, it's bringing in this concept of, I guess, this relationship between ecological degradation, resilience, and conflict. But if we're looking at it, so these problems are here today, and they manifest particularly in areas of the world like the Sahel. And there are three what we can see as corridors of these which have got the greatest threats. So the first one of them is up around the Sahel Horn of Africa, running through there. The next one is in the sub-Saharan Africa, or in lower sub-Saharan Africa, starting at Angola and running across to Mauritius. And the final area runs from the Middle East through to South Asia. And so that starts in Syria, runs through Iraq, over into Pakistan and up into Afghanistan. So these are the three areas where we see the biggest risk. But the Sahel, we spent a lot of time studying the Sahel, and that's an area which is a particular worry for us. But I think also what we've found is that the drivers of the ecological damage, the stresses for conflict, are only getting worse. So for example, if we're looking at food insecurity, it had been improving for decades, but what we can see in the last 7 years, since 2014, each year the number of people who are food insecure has increased, and that reverses this decades-long trend. In fact, what we found is that you've got 2.3 billion people now globally are food insecure. That's an increase of 44% from 2014 and covers about a third of the people on the planet.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and these hotspots that you pointed out, we see it kind of in the news. We see it recently in what's been happening in Afghanistan and other countries like it, that these are places that are very highly at risk and have low resilience, and their prospects for peace are definitely dimmer. Could we expand quickly upon, before we go any further, on the concept of positive peace and just kind of what that means?
Sure.
As it's such a big metric.
So if we're looking at positive peace, that's described as the attitude, the definition of positive peace is the attitude, institutions and structures which create or sustain peaceful societies. Now, how do we arrive at it? And I think this is the interesting thing of the work. So what we've done is we've got the Global Peace Index. So we've got about 50,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys here in Sydney, which have been done at the national level. And so what we do then is mathematically modelling, statistical analysis to determine the factors which are most closely associated with peaceful societies. We then use other mathematical formulas to now be able to turn that and clump the ones which are most statistically significant together. And that forms what we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. Now, you can take that and turn that round into another index, and that's where it gets really exciting, because now you've got something which is a really strong measure of resilience. But what's more, what we can then discover is the same factors which create peace also create a whole lot of other things which we think are important in society, like higher per capita income. So or on average, countries which are improving in positive peace have 2% higher GDP growth per annum than countries which are deteriorating in positive peace. Countries perform better on measures of ecology, much better in terms of both improving and sustaining their ecology, perform better on measures of well-being and happiness, better on measures of inclusion. So in many ways, we describe positive peace as describing an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. We started with peace and ended up with something which was much, much more powerful. Definitely. In fact, when you're using positive peace as a measure of resilience, for let's say, what you find there is that we can forecast 10 years ahead, okay, using the relationship between positive peace and the actual measures of peace. And we can get a 70 to 90% accuracy rate on countries which are likely to have substantial falls in peace. In fact, the percentage or the accuracy rate increases as you shrink the number of countries which you actually have in the frame for the measure. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Definitely a much more holistic kind of look at what peace really means, and which is definitely useful if we're making projections into the future and trying to assess not only stability but also well-being and prosperity, which is kind of is the big question here. Going back to kind of the nature of climate change, or how climate change is addressed within this report, what makes this report unique, I found, was that yes, climate change is treated quite independently from the other ecological risks, ecological threats.
Yeah. Well, the reason we did that is that, like, climate change is really important and deserves the attention it's getting. But the problem is we've got these issues which exist today, and if they're not addressed today, then they're going to get to a point where a lot of it's going to be almost impossible to solve. And that'll also impact back on the ability for us to be able to control carbon CO2 emissions, particularly in places like Africa or South Asia, which have got large areas of population. So climate change to us is an amplifier. So as temperatures rise, what you're going to find is you're going to have less water available in a lot of the temperate areas in the world. It'll evaporate faster. You're likely to have bigger flash floods, which then degrade the environment further with runoff of topsoils. Droughts will increase as well, and sort of the length and intensity of them as well, as will sort of cyclones and so these things sort of really will come in and play in on these ecological threats, but they exist separately. Just to sort of look at it and drive it home, we'll just look at Africa. So there are 12 countries in the world which are projected to more than double their population in the next 30 years. They're all in Africa. So the one with the largest likely increase is Niger at 161%. So these are countries which are already in conflict. They're countries which are already stressed for resources. In fact, if we look at all of Africa, the population is expected to increase 90%. And this is only 30 years. So this is unsustainable. So we don't want to be thinking 30 years down the track, 10 years down the track. And so the ability to be able to keep social cohesion when you've got those kind of stresses on your natural resources is exceptionally difficult.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Do you think that this is a easier way in terms of getting the message across and getting these ideas across to the public, kind of focusing more on these ecological threats, on these maybe perhaps more tangible impacts that can happen, rather than the idea of climate change, which can come off as a little abstract, a little vague, a little far off in the future?
Oh, I think there's two things here. One is the ecological threats is separate than climate change. They're there today and they're getting worse. So we need attention on them as a separate issue. But also with that also drags a look at climate change in as well. But it also brings us back to what's actually happening in the world today. And I think that's the power of it. In terms of the Institute for Economics and Peace, we've got a number of ways of getting that message out. So part of it is talking on this podcast with you, my friend. That's part of it. Also, we release the Ecological Threat Report each year. And with it, we put in a big PR push. So this year we sort of like, well, would have been within the first 20 hours of the launch, we had over 600 articles globally with reach of about 5 billion people. So that would be the media impressions. We then sort of also talk a lot. We could then go out and do a number of podcasts on it, like this one. We also talk at a number of conferences. So we've done presentations for this, let's say, in most of the leading cities in the world. So done them in Washington, New York, Geneva, Brussels, Den Haag, just to name some. And so then we sort of also get it into a lot of the major presentations, and also we do your presentations in the universities as well around it. And that's the technique. We've also got quite a strong media reach. So last year, the Institute off everything, we had about 1.7 billion social media impressions. So we also then have a strong social media push out with it as well. So we do a lot of things to try and publicise it, and certainly it's got its own unique place. So there's all sorts of organisations interested, even groups like the UN Office on Countering Terrorism, for example, see it as being really helpful in giving them an idea of where the future hotspots might be for them.
Fantastic. So, so you mentioned the UN and how kind of you've interacted with the public, but how about with policymakers, with decision makers? How do you think that, since this report's release and last year's release, what has the conversation been like between the Institute and with policymakers who have read the report?
So we're engaged with the UN and other major multilaterals in all sorts of different ways. So, for example, we do contract research, and our works are used by people like the UN, World Bank, Commonwealth Secretariat, OECD, just to name some. We've recently struck up a relationship with the World Trade Organization. They've created a peace bureau, and that's to look with the accession of new countries into the WTO. And so they're using a lot of our work in terms of their training for the way these countries should go about approaching their development, because obviously the peace is part of it. But as I mentioned earlier on, when you look at the positive piece, it's a much bigger subject. And so it gives the countries an idea of just what they should be looking at to try and actually grow the kind of society which will be economically prosperous, be able to benefit from the accession into the WTO, and then also to be able to improve the peacefulness and the economic wealth of the countries as well. So that'd be one example. Sort of, if we look at, let's say, the OECD might be another one. So they've got a state of fragility report. We've developed a framework which they use for that, and upgraded a couple of times over the years. Probably do it again. I guess more in the future. That'll be some more examples. We quite often give presentations at conferences and other such things. With Secretary General, I've got another piece of work which looks at the cost of violence, the global economy. Multiple Secretary Generals have quoted that piece of work and the figures from that in their speeches many times. So that'd be some of the examples of just what we have going on.
Great. To go a bit more into the details of the report, I guess first I'd like to ask, what is the main difference, the main change that you've noticed between this report and the inaugural edition last year?
Well, I think what we can see is that there's more. We can see that the areas in the Sahel, for example, are getting worse. Okay, we can see that clearly. I think I've mentioned food security. I think that's really much worse. Like a lot of that comes down to COVID. So we talk about those 7 years where you've had the food insecurity increasing each year. The worst was last year, and of that 44% increase, 24% of it happened during COVID. We can also see that if you're looking at global food prices, according to the World Food Index, in the last 2 years, they've gone up 26%. Malnutrition's on the rise. There's 770 million people now who are malnourished. That's up 45% since 2014. So that's a big increase. That's a big increase. And the other thing I think which shocked me is we move forward and we start to look at the population dynamics. And I've spoken a little bit about Africa, but if we project out to 2050, what we're going to find that the 4.8 billion people are going to live in the 40 least peaceful countries in the world. That's an increase 27% in the population. And I guess that was one of the things which really, really shocked me as well. Really shocked me as well, because you can see that you're just getting this ecological degradation happening in the places which are least likely to be able to support it. One of the other things too, which was really quite fascinating, was we worked with a group out of London called Lloyd's Register, and they'd produced a series of polling on the risks. It was about something like 60 different risks. And one of them had a question on climate change. So we analysed that and put it into the report. It was fascinating. So the question went, do you think that your climate change will be a serious problem for your country in the next 20 years? And so the global average was about 50%. But country with the highest score, and I thought it was serious, was Chile. The second one was Spain. And what was fascinating, that 12 of the 20 countries with the highest concern either spoke Spanish or Portuguese. Now, when we look at climate change, and we'll come back to that, so there's 3 countries in the world which by far the biggest emitters. That's the US, China, obviously, which is by far even bigger than the US, and then India, which is increasing all the time. So the US, it's about 50% of the people there see it as a serious problem in the next 20 years. So that's about the same as the global average. But if we come to China, only 23% of the people in China see it as a major concern. That's the 6th lowest of all the countries we polled. India, it's at 35%. And what that poses in my mind, so that climate change is either going to be won or lost in India, but how successful can the government be unless it's got the people on board and on side to see it as a serious problem? So that I think that was one of the big takeaways in relationship to climate change. There are a few other things, like genders were about the same in terms of concern. Men were about 2% more concerned than women. Scandinavian countries were quite low, okay? So Finland was about 27%, Denmark was 38%, Norway 38%, and Sweden was 39%. So look, that's not what you'd expect from the Scandinavian countries. So that was another really interesting takeaway on that piece of research.
Definitely. The China statistic really surprises me, startles me. That's do you think that's down to the way that the governments are communicating the threats, or the way that is being
discussed? Look, I think it is. And so I think a lot of the time, like how do people realize that climate change is serious? And generally it's through the media. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so again, it comes back to what's reflected in the media. And it's not to say China's not serious about climate change. It's just commenting on where their citizens are at. But you'd think if you really want to get change, then you really got to get the citizens on board.
Right. Moving on to kind of the question of conflict and how that intersects with the ecological threat. We mentioned that you mentioned that the most at-risk country is Afghanistan, and that several other countries who are in the high-risk category are either in conflict or have recently emerged from conflict. To what extent do you think that demilitarization is necessary to achieve these positive peace outcomes and more resilience in the world?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again?
Sure. So demilitarization as a
Oh,
kind
okay,
of
yeah.
yeah, is it necessary? If so, to what extent?
Yeah, look at, I think when we're looking at demilitarization, it gets complex. So if you've got the Sahel, okay, so you've got very weak governance up there. You've got a number of Islamist terrorist organizations or militias operating, which have got loyalty to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. You've got French troops up there, UN peacekeeping troops in other areas. So unless you're not going to solve it without a military response. Okay, so once you're in conflict, and you've got sort of groups like that, you need a military response. But the problem is that quite often governments, particularly Western governments, rely just on a military response. They think that's going to fix everything, and it won't. Most military people these days realise it. They say, look, we can stop a conflict and we'll give you a window of time, but you then got to get in and focus on other things and get the development right. And just to really highlight that, let's look at Afghanistan. Okay, so the most conservative estimate I can find for the cost of violence in Afghanistan was 2.3 trillion. It was probably more like 5 to 7 trillion. Right. Now, if you do it off the most conservative estimate, 2.3 trillion, that's 100 times the annual per capita income of an Afghan. 100 times the annual per capita income of an Afghanistan. Wow. Now, if you gave each person in there 10 times the per capita income, do you think it would have ended up more peaceful? And so the lesson from this, and this we've really got to learn this, the lesson from this, if the development's bad, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at a problem, you're not going to solve it. Mm-hmm. So we've really got to get a lot smarter about how we go about trying to solve some of these really intractable problems like the Sahel.
Right, yeah. And certainly it comes down to governance. If there's good governance, if there's good infrastructure, if there's good measures to adapt, to build resilience, and if these countries do not have the resources or even the expertise to invest into this infrastructure, then
so when you're looking at it, what I'd say is that a lot of these problems are systemic in nature, but we don't go about using systemic solutions. Okay, so for example, okay, UN does a lot of great work, okay, a lot of great work. And same, we've been talking on the Sahel. So, all right, so you've got insurgent groups there, so you need a military response. You've got a refugee issue, so you've got UNHCR involved. You've got massive increases in population, so you've got the UN Population Fund involved. You've got UNDP, which again is a whole lot of siloed work. So that may be examples that might be, let's say, WASH programs, other standard developmental aids. You'll have UNICEF in there looking after the children and the women. You'll have FAO in working on the agriculture. And then you'll have other groups in working on let's say the business side of it, then you'll have things like the World Bank or the IMF in trying to improve the governance in these countries as well. So what you've got is a very siloed approach to a systemic problem. What we need to do is to be able to somehow pull on those agencies and form some sort of integrated agency which can now focus on a specific area. But firstly, to do that, know exactly what resources you need to get a full understanding of the problem, and that's from a systemic perspective, and we don't do enough of that at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you mentioned this solution of this one singular integrated agency that could push through these changes, these solutions. But the report also mentions that funding will be an issue, and that international agencies alone might not be able to come up with the required funding.
Well, I guess that comes back and brings us back to the example from Afghanistan. So 2.3 trillion isn't enough to be able to improve the development of a country of 40 million people. Then what do you do when you move into areas with 250 million people, or as Africa, which I think's got about 400 million? It's on a different scale, and so we really need to get a lot smarter about it. I think one of the other things which is missing in a lot of this is how do you actually take business and leverage business to be able to solve these problems. And I'm not talking about big business. I'm not talking about your multilateral, your international companies. I'm not talking about your Googles or General Electrics or companies like that. It's small scale business. It's your on the ground entrepreneur who's trying to employ 20 to 200 people, and they come out of the local environment. And so through better capture of water, it gets you more agriculture. If you've got more agriculture, that does give you the ability then to be able to have excess produce which you can sell. You then have small scale canning, let's say, built around it. And from there, what you've got is the ability now to start to build out some sort of infrastructure for local commerce. That then increases the wealth in the areas, which again starts a virtuous cycle. So one of the other hats I've got a family foundation which works with the poorest of the poor, and so it's extensively active in, let's say, Africa, for example, particularly East and Central Africa. We've sort of done over 220 projects out of that charity now, and we can see it with a number of these concepts we've got for water capture. Then the agricultural around it, it quite often can increase the yield for the people and the participants by 200%. So it's 3 times the amount of yield they're getting out of the land and what they're getting in the past. And a lot of this stuff isn't expensive, but you need somehow to be able to stimulate it so it actually can happen as a business enterprise. And that'd be, if you've got local people then investing in, let's say, concepts of sand dams, and I won't go into the detail of sand dams, but an incredibly efficient way of capturing water. You put a pump in, okay, some business guy funds the cost of the dam, which is about 25 to 50,000 US. You then might have 100 families which are been able to now move from 1 crop a year to 2 to 3 crops a year based on the water. Then the excess income they pay back to the business guy, and now he's got a thriving business. They got the excess. You now create a co-op between a number of the people, number of the families there, and we've done this. We've done all this stuff successfully, and you put little canning around it. It can be canning of pineapples is one which we've done. Another one's tomatoes, and now you've got the value add which the locals get rather than some massive international food company.
Right.
It's a lot of the time when you look at it, you might like, I guess what would be a good example is the coffee. So there's a lot of great programs around coffee, but a lot of the time it's the big multilaterals buying the multinational companies are buying the coffee, and so that's fine. So it's a little bit better off for the locals, but it's nothing like they own the industries themselves.
Right. So
other things, simple things like refrigeration for transporting food, okay, into a city. You can triple the value to the farmers if you've got a co-op and you've now got refrigeration so that can store it rather than it goes off the next day in the fields.
Right, of course. These are within this scope. Do developmental agencies do they provide expertise, or do they provide startup costs and things like that, or is it very kind of local knowledge and indigenous kind of
practice? Well, I think there's a lot of great NGOs around, and a lot of them do very, very good programs dealing with the improving the yield and building sand dams and those kind of things. But it's the entrepreneurial part of it which is missing. NGOs by nature aren't entrepreneurial, okay? They're more into giving. So it's somehow changing the mindset in these things so that there's the opportunity there for because if people can make money, it's self-scaling. It's self-scaling.
Right. This
And anyway,
you kind of,
that's the area where I think there's a lot of opportunity if we can just really think about it properly and also empower the best entrepreneurs.
Definitely. This kind of brings to mind, also speaking of the Sahel, what was once the Great Green Wall Initiative that wasn't quite successful, the regreening project to stop desertification in the Sahel. It wasn't successful because of its scope, because of how many different areas it was trying to address. But it did bring to light many indigenous agricultural practices and many kind of more local based ideas and local ideas to make yields more profitable, to grow more in in conditions of droughts and things like that. And it turned out to be quite an effective and quite a promising, or a lot of promising solutions emerged from it. So that's kind of the same idea we're talking about, just focusing more on local abilities, local knowledge, right?
Yeah, I think quite often with the aid, the concepts I'm giving is sort of small scale. You're really focusing on small groups of people, but they really do know what they need best. They do know where their best opportunity is. And so, look, I think we can learn a lot from a better engagement. But techniques like you were talking about, like one technique, FMNR, farmer managed natural regeneration, that's worked wonders through parts of the Sahel. It's not enough to correct a lot of the other problems. But Niger, for example, even with its huge increase in population and it's got multiple conflicts going on there, it's actually improved its vegetation coverage over the last 20 years, which is one of the few countries in the world to actually do that. So these techniques, like the FMNR techniques, are excellent techniques, and I think in many ways, if we can do more of them, we may be able to start to get that greening which we'd like. But it's very hard when you're looking at population increase of over 100% in 30 years.
Of course, right. That's the worry, of course.
You need twice as much vegetation as what's being consumed at the moment to be able to satisfy the population increase.
Of course. How does migration figure into it? Because obviously not everyone, especially in regions, in unstable regions that we're talking about here, not everyone will be able to stay. And we're predicting that there's going to be large waves of migrants.
I think, yeah, if we're looking at forced displacement or refugees, definition of a refugee is pretty much a forced displacement through conflict. That's only going to increase. So if we're looking at, there's 83 million people now are currently displaced by conflict. That's gone up 100% in the last 20 years. So if we went back 20 years ago, it's about 40 million people. So look, give you an idea, that's 1 in every 90 people on the planet. Okay, that's when you put it like that, you look out in your office, if you've got 100 people there, one of them would be forcibly displaced as a refugee if it was a part of the globe. And so, look, this is a major issue. What we find is that about 1 in 3 people travel beyond the borders of their country, and another way of looking at travel more than 600 kilometres. So that then sort of places pressure on other countries as well. The other thing is when people get displaced through conflict, quite often it's very hard for them to get back. It's unlike when they're displaced, let's say, through a flood or a cyclone and also sort of a drought. Droughts are a bit longer, but the people tend to come back to where they came from once the crisis has passed. That's not true for conflict. And so we need to get much better policies for being able to manage the refugee flows. And at this stage, sort of, there's a lot of emphasis on erecting walls on the border and sort of having fortress mentalities. And look, I get it, that works well for domestic politics because a lot of people are scared of immigrants, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a lot better processes for being able to actually absorb refugees into the country, because most people are okay with immigration. They're not okay with refugees. So it's a matter of sort of, if you've got the staging camps somewhere else, and you're just actually now increase your immigration flows, and you pull your immigrations out of the refugee camps rather than other places. It's one of the techniques you can use to start to try and solve this issue. But it's going forward, my estimates are we're going to end up with a lot more people forcibly displaced, and that 80 million will just increase out to 120 million, 160 million, wherever.
Right. And I believe the report mentioned that Europe is projected to be the main destination for refugees, especially climate refugees.
Well, it depends. Look, it depends on which where the conflicts come from. So obviously, if we go back to the Syrian conflict, you had 2/3 of the population, or 65%, were displaced. Now you had 2/3 of them within the country, but the other third outside, and so a lot of them, and then with the Iraq war also, now a lot of them ended up in Europe. And from memory, I think it was 2.3 million people ended up in Western Europe. You had about another 8 million end up in Turkey. So Turkey's got So Turkey's out of all the European countries got the most refugees, but you've ended up with an awful lot of displaced people. So now travelling from the Sahel to Europe, it's a long way. So if you've got the collapses there, further ecological collapses, and then sort of migration from there, that most of that will mainly push south. Some of it will push north. But if you've got further collapses in, let's say, the Middle East, now that migratory tract, or South Asia, those migratory tracts may be up to Europe.
Right. So, the report includes projections up to 2050. And where do you see kind of, talking about all these trends that are happening, migratory trends, climate trends, where do you see the hotspots that we're talking about right now continuing to be the main sources of conflict within the next few decades? Or do you see it being more of a mosaic, just kind of shifting around depending on conditions?
Well, my sense on this is I don't like this at all, but my sense on it is we're going to see these problems intensify over the next decade. I don't think the international community's got the be or where to actually really address it. And these are systemic problems. We may go through periods where we find conflict ease, like Yemen may end up with a peace deal in Yemen, let's say. But the underlying drivers for the ecological degradation aren't going to go away unless they really, really get addressed. So I'm expecting probably over the next decade, a number of areas will get worse. Forecasting exactly which one's going to collapse and when is a dangerous pastime. It's many smarter people than themselves have fallen on their sword on that one. So I'm not going to attempt to do that. But it's but I think these issues are serious. So we can see with the rising food insecurity, rising malnutrition, and rising population, the drivers aren't going away.
Right. There's this this kind of adage that we need strong climate action in order to have peace, and that climate change and climate equity is interlinked with poverty and instability. Do you agree with these statements? And do you think they have?
I think what I'd say is climate change is going to be, we've got a little bit of climate change going on now, but it's nothing to what's going to be there 30 to 50 years in the future. These are going to act as amplifiers on current problems which are existing there today.
Right.
So that'd be the way I'd feel it.
Definitely. So looking kind of to the future, I mean, you personally, do you think we as a species can find a pathway to a sustainable future, or how do you see the outlook?
Yeah, well, it depends. It's when we talk sustainable future, it's a big thing because there are all sorts of different domains on sustainability. So one's water sustainability, food sustainability, population sustainability, CO2 emission sustainability, sustainability of the oceans, and so they're different perspectives. So what I can see is that if we're looking, let's say, at population, food, and water, there's a whole range of countries in the world which will be quite sustainable going forward. But obviously, if you're looking at CO2 emissions, it's that affects everyone, as does issues, let's say, around the state of the ocean. Okay, so the oceans are all interconnected as well. So it depends on which of the sustainability issues you're actually looking at. So I think for countries like Western Europe, when you're looking at ecological degradation, they're doing well. They're doing the best in the world. But it all comes back to how well the governments and the societies function. And that comes back to positive peace, because that gives an idea of the resilience and the adaptability of society and its wherewithal and its effectiveness to be able to actually address its problems. And that's the issue. In the long run, it's the issue. None of these problems are solvable, but we need new ways of being able to think about how do we go about developing our societies. And that's where we think positive peace is a transformational concept when combined with systems thinking. It's a new way of thinking about how do you go about doing development.
Definitely, that's great. One closing question, just kind of need to address that. Obviously, as we're having this talk, the COP26 is occurring in Glasgow, and how do you feel that these ideas are, and this notion of positive peace and these intersections that we've been talking about, do you feel that they're being discussed at these conferences, at these climate talks?
I think there's certainly discussion there, and if you look at who's attending COP26, you've got a whole range of different actors and players. You've got the scientific community, which is really knowledgeable around a lot of these issues. You've got a number of NGOs out there. You've got representatives for the first time of a lot of the indigenous cultures. Mm-hmm. Then also you've got a whole lot of politicians there as well, and a number of business people who've got vested interests in either side of the climate debate. So it's a whole range of actors there. I think some of the statements coming out of COP have been very, very good, particularly sort of on the protecting the rainforests and biodiversity. That was new, so that was excellent. The commitments to net zero are also good, but a lot of the time, and this is where I get a little bit skeptical, it's very easy for the governments to make these promises down in the future. But if we look at, since the Paris Agreement, not a lot has really changed globally, okay? Emissions are still going up. Mm-hmm. So what's somehow needed is much better policies to be able to actually get the governments to be able to commit to the promises they make. And the issue lies around the commitment to the promises, not the actual making of the promises. Because it's easy for me or you to sit here and be talking to our audience and make a commitment, which is 30 years down the track. Yeah. It's much harder to do the actions today to implement the change for 30 years down the track.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, we hope that these solutions that the ETR proposes, that these recommendations that your institute has made, that they gain traction, and these are profitable solutions, right? These are things that can make money, which and they can improve lives even in a short-term kind of fashion. So definitely there's a lot of promise there to see these initiatives kind of push through. And especially even if governments decide to put through, and we can debate on this too, but put through pricing policies on carbon and regulating emissions and kind of holding polluters accountable, we definitely see a lot of momentum, especially if those kind of frameworks are put in place towards seeing these visions realized.
Yeah, no, it's very true. The final thing I'd like to say is I've written a book called Peace in the Age of Chaos. So people like the ideas I've been talking about here. I'd suggest purchase Peace in the Age of Chaos. You can get it from all the normal places you purchase a book from, Amazon, Google, and other such places. So anyway, that sets out a lot of the idea. Well, it more fully explains the ideas I've been talking about here today.
Great, thank you. We're very interested in reading it ourselves. Thanks a lot. Great, so thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your
Yeah,
knowledge.
look,
And
my pleasure.
yeah,
Okay.
and with our audience, we'd be very interested in this, in reading your book and seeing what your institute comes out with in the future as well.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.